So today is the day that the i9-14900K launches, the so-called Raptor Lake refresh. And I'm sure that you guys are seeing a ton of content out there, from Intel marketing fluff saying this is the fastest CPU on the planet, to reviews either saying it's slow as hell and underperforming, or it just demolishes every single benchmark. But the i9-14900K, it's actually a lot better than you might think it is, and it's actually a lot worse. A lot of that has to do with some sneaky little tricks to enhance performance by running beyond Intel's so-called specs and an architecture that's actually a lot more efficient than some folks give it credit for. And this video is actually pretty simple. It's to get to the bottom of things and cut through some of the confusion about the 14900K so you guys can make a more informed purchasing decision if you're actually looking for one of these things still after this video is done. Looking for something different from your CPU cooler? Meet Deepcool's new AK Digital series that add a retro-style digital display showing CPU usage and temperature in a straightforward but completely unique and tasteful way. With these, you get one of the most unique air cooling experiences around. The new Deepcool AK400, AK500, and AK620 digital coolers. Performance and innovation combined into awesome looking coolers for every situation. Find them at the links below. If you look at the 14900K's specs, it's understandable where the whole refresh term comes from. It's basically a ground up copy paste of the 13900K from an architectural standpoint, with clock speeds that are more aligned with the 13900KS. But because of a more mature manufacturing process, it has a slightly lower base power than the KS version, which technically means it should be able to clock itself higher than the previous designs at a given power level. And technically, a more efficient, better optimized package should make it as easy, if not easier, to cool than Intel's 13th gen, right? Well, let's find out. So let's first set the chip to run at Intel's limits, and it behaves exactly like the 13900K did. It shoots up to 253 watts under an all-core workload and just stays there all day, provided you have the necessary cooling. There's a hiccup though. Few motherboards these days actually respect Intel's limits, especially the mid-level to higher-end ones most reviewers tend to use. Instead, in their out-of-box defaults, or so-called optimized settings, they shoot straight for the moon, while Intel's own limits need to be manually enforced by you in the BIOS. And this is how the out-of-box so-called optimized defaults look on two of ASUS's boards, a Z690 and a Z790. The 14900K gets blasted by between 332 and 340 watts of power. That's actually right in line with what the motherboard does when you just completely remove Intel's limits entirely, which really causes some questions about motivations here when you see how the 13900K behaves in this exact same situation on the same motherboards. Intel's 253 watt limit, yep, that's there and adhered to. But here, the ROG motherboard uses its auto setting to give a short burst of power, whereupon it falls back to Intel's defaults. Now on the Raptor Lake refresh, that same setting results in even more excessive long-term power consumption. So why was this actually done? I don't want to point fingers just yet, but if we drill down into the clock speeds, I think things become a lot clearer. At Intel's limits, we're looking at a pretty constant 5.27 gigahertz clock speed on the P cores, whereas in auto or no limits modes, we're looking at something in the neighborhood of 5.63 gigahertz. That's not a ton of additional speed for 80 watts more power, but you have to remember, clearly, Intel's hitting the law of diminishing returns between power versus frequencies here. Raptor Lake, it seems to be pretty much played out when it comes to performance. And let's overlay the 13900K again to drill that point home. And you can start to see what's going on. If the 14900K runs within Intel's own specifications, it's only a few megahertz faster than its predecessor, which makes the new chip look absolutely pointless. But that auto setting now gives it a clear advantage, even if the 13900K is running completely uncorked. And naturally, I think all of you might be thinking that this has a completely devastating effect on the 14900K's temperatures, but not so fast, because this is where things get really interesting. Now remember, this is with a 360mm AIO running full out, and there's a few callouts to be made here. First of all, at Intel limits with the 13900K added in the background, you can clearly see the 14900K does run a bit cooler at the same power level. That's 253 watts. Run both CPUs at balls to the wall, and the newer chip is cooler yet again. This leads me to believe Intel and their motherboard partners are using the additional thermal headroom hinted at in the limited test to pump more power into the refreshed chip. This so-called optimized or auto setting, which is actually pushing beyond Intel's limits, is what most people and reviewers will experience when just dropping this CPU into a Z690 or Z790 motherboard. And no, I understand, we all understand that this is not anything new. Intel and their motherboard partners have been doing this for several generations now. But what is different is that this CPU, the 14900K, absolutely, positively needs to run way beyond Intel's limits to make one iota of a difference in its performance benchmarks. Cinebench highlights this really well, with the 14900K barely beating the 13900K with limits enforced, and the 7950X gets mighty close too, but used the default setting on most motherboards, and it's a convincing win with an improvement of over 3,000 points. Pretty much every single multi-threaded test bears this out in some way, shape, or form. So if you're benchmarking at Intel's enforced limits, the overall CPU landscape is very, very different, and the 14900K ends up looking a heck of a lot worse. Meanwhile, you have to take into account that running in auto mode without most limits enforced can actually cook the books in Intel's favor, substantially more than it did with Intel's 13th gen. There is one area that bucks that trend: lightly threaded scenarios. In those situations, power limits become a non-issue, so running without limits doesn't boost results. Here, the 14900K's higher turbo frequencies can really start flexing their muscles. There's other areas, like in Premiere, where the GPU contributes its own limitations, so you barely get any uplift whatsoever by moving from 13th to 14th gen CPUs, especially since they have identical IGPs. And speaking of less highly threaded scenarios, that's where gaming gets factored into the equation, because this is probably where the 14900K will have the biggest advantage without setting your CPU cooler on fire. It retains extremely high clock speeds in those lightly threaded scenarios. And gaming just happens to be what probably most of you guys are looking at the 14900K for in the first place. I needed to find a worst case scenario too. Enter Cyberpunk 2077 with its newest 2.0 patch and Phantom Liberty updates. Based on our testing, this is one of, if not the heaviest game that tops out our CPU utilization charts. But even then, the 14900K doesn't consume any more power than the 13900K. It doesn't matter if it's with or without Intel's limits. As a matter of fact, it's sipping back a few watts less at both settings, though it comes nowhere near how efficient the AMD CPUs are here. Focusing solely on temperatures of the Intel chips, the 14900K also has the benefit of running a lot cooler too, with the AIO running at 100%. But let's also add a little wrinkle into this by running it at 50% too. Yep, still no problem at all. And what about air cooling? Well, with a good mid-priced air cooler like the AK620 running at 100%, we still stayed well below 85 degrees. And once again, a few degrees better than the 13900K. Switching the air cooler to 50% did pose a bit more of a challenge, though the heat levels still remained lower than Intel's 13th gen. Frame rates weren't adversely impacted by any of these cooling options either. Even the AK620 running at just 50% fan speed in a game that takes infinitely more CPU resources than 99.9% of other titles. So the conclusion to gaming is no different than it was during my 13th gen myth busting video. Even with a good air cooler, you will get optimal frame rates on Intel's new highest end CPUs. As for actual clock speeds, well, when averaged across every single game that we tested, the 14900K was consistently running 130 to 200 megahertz faster than the 13900K. But does that actually make a difference? First of all, I need to mention here that I'm adding the 7800X3D into these results, and I'm happy I did, because its numbers prove that you don't need to spend 14900K money to get an awesome gaming focused CPU. Flipping to the Intel side, in relatively lightly threaded games, the 14900K has a narrow advantage at best over the 13900K. Yet most of that lead evaporates whenever there's a GPU-heavy situation, so it becomes a dead heat between the two. Oh, and there's absolutely no difference between running with or without limits. So does Intel have the fastest gaming CPU right now? It completely depends on the game you're playing, but overall the answer is no. Intel has an X3D problem on their hands, and the 14th gen CPUs aren't gonna fix it. These aren't even a band-aid solution. Therefore, if you are buying a brand new gaming system right now, I would recommend that you just grab the 7800 X3D, save a couple of $100 and call it a day. Not only that, you're going to get a AM5 platform that supposedly has a lot more life left in it than LGA 1700, which is seemingly ending right now with the Raptor Lake refresh. But what happens if you are on, I don't know, like a 12900K chip and you still want to stay in the same platform? Well, I still wouldn't recommend the 14900K at that point. I would recommend right now waiting until Black Friday, because I can almost guarantee you, I'm not going to put money on it, but I can almost guarantee you that there are going to be some screaming deals on the 13900K and the KS. Look, I hope that this video ends up helping you guys see both sides of Intel's 14th gen coin, what's happening with power, how it can affect reviews, and maybe and hopefully it changes going forward. So anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I'm off on vacation and I will see you on the next one. Have a great day.